before we start talking about aggregate demand, I want to talk about the idea of aggregate supply, but in the short run. So we're going to be looking at what is sometimes referred to as the short run aggregate supply curve, or also as the Phillips curve. Now, keep in mind, in microeconomics, we have supply and demand. In macroeconomics, we have what we'll see later, aggregate demand and aggregate supply. But be very careful about this comparison because they're actually incorrect. The word aggregate here is very important because we're looking at an entire economy, whereas in the case of microeconomics, supply and demand, we're only looking at one specific market. I'm going to start with this idea of aggregate supply, specifically the short-run aggregate supply, and I'm going to do this in 4 steps. Then later, for the remainder of the course, in fact, we'll be looking at the aggregate demand. Note that Keynes actually didn't really think explicitly about this aggregate supply curve. He was much more concerned about the aggregate demand. And so the aggregate supply, as we're going to look at it today, is relatively recent. I would say it dates, well, the Phillips curve dates from the 1960s, and then the presentation I've got here dates from the 1970s and 80s. It's more recent. It's still part of a Keynesian model or a macroeconomic model, but it wasn't explicit in Keynes' situation. As we'll see today in part why that is. So, the short-run aggregate supply curve, very much like we looked at before the supply, what's distinct here is you'll notice that the idea of technology, physical capital is fixed at a particular moment. So that means to say that the economy in the short run is only capable really of adjusting the labor supply, the number of people working. So we're looking at a period of time that may be like 6 months, a year, or something like that. Now, as we've seen before, F represents a production function, where K is the physical capital, roads and infrastructure and so on that's available. L is the number of employed workers, and of course Y is the real GDP that's being produced. These are all real variables, and A represents things like management abilities, technological skills. I looked at before the idea of including natural resources. I'm just ignoring that here. So what's critical, the straight line on top here, on top of the K and here, means that it's fixed. It's not variable, so these can't be adjusted or changed. So very simply, the idea is to produce real GDP, firms need workers, so the general idea is that if number of people employed increases, as we've seen before, real GDP would increase, and vice versa. There's a direct relationship between these. And at the same time, it means the unemployment rate would go down, for example, if the economy is producing more things. Let's look at this first step 1 in this process. We've already seen the long-run aggregate supply curve, but what I want to point out here is that if the economy, for example, is on the left-hand side of the long-run aggregate supply curve, so it's below, the economy is producing below potential, then what we'd say is the unemployment rate, the cyclical or Keynesian unemployment rate, is going to be higher. There's fewer people employed, fewer people working. If you're on the economy's on this vertical line, then we'd say that there would be some unemployment due to frictional unemployment and maybe structural unemployment alone. So the economy is below potential when it's in this yellow area on the left. On the other hand, it's possible for the economy to be above potential for whatever reason. It's capable of producing more than it would normally produce, in which case we'd say that the cyclical unemployment, in some areas it's negative, or the economy is having the job rate, the unemployment rate is below the natural rate. So these are the 2 situations this is the step 1. So the economy in the short run can be below potential. In the short run, it could be above potential. In the long run, of course, it would be on, this is what the definition of potential GDP would be, this vertical line. So that's step 1. Now, step 2 is this concept of nominal, but applied not to GDP, but rather to the wage rate, how much people get paid. And what's the distinction between the nominal wage and the real wage? Well, it's the same distinction as between nominal GDP and real GDP. Bear in mind that the concept of nominal and real is a key idea in this course. So the nominal wage refers to how much money you get paid. So it's dollars, the dollars you get paid, how much money you have. The real wage refers to what you can purchase with this wage. So when you go to the store and you want to buy something, how much can you really purchase? And as I say, the difference is in inflation. If there's no inflation, in effect, it's like saying there's no difference between the nominal and real wage. Let's take a quick glance at this idea, though, to understand this a bit more clearly. Now, I've got data here for about a year or 2 years ago. I think the minimum wage is a bit higher right now, but just use this as an example. The minimum wage in July 2019 was about $12.50 per hour, and the cost of a student pass for the STM, this is on the island of Montreal, was about $52. That's per month, the monthly fee. When I looked into the data in the past, and in January 2001, the minimum wage was $6.90. So it's a little bit, almost half what it is now. But a student pass, on the other hand, was only $22.50. It was less than half. So in effect, what this means is that if we looked at it in terms of the amount, what it cost to purchase a Metro Pass, I can quickly see that the minimum wage, while it went up, it did not go up as quickly as the cost of taking the Metro for a student. And this is the concept that we're referring to in terms of the real wage. So we can see this, that the minimum wage increased by about 80%, whereas the cost of taking the Metro increased by 130%. So in these terms, we'd say that while the minimum wage, the nominal wage increased, the real wage decreased. Of course, the STM Metro Pass is only one item that would go into a consumer basket. So a better way to do this would be to consider something broader like the CPI. Now, the Consumer Price Index has a large, to the extent that students purchase the items in the common basket. So I looked at this just to find out. In January 2001, it's 96.8. What is it now? It's around 130 or so. So in those, if we use the CPI basket, we can see that the minimum wage, the real wage has increased, but not very much. But let's take a look at a much broader length of time to understand this idea. Here what I've got is the minimum wage in 1967. So we're going back over 50 years. It was about $1 an hour. While at the same time, the CPI was about 18. So that means you went into a store, you wanted to buy something, a basket of goods, it would cost you about $18, let's say. 2018, 50 years later, minimum wage is about $12 an hour, and the cost of the same basket now is about $138. So what does that mean in terms of, well, we can clearly see that the nominal wage has gone up about 12 times, but the CPI has gone up about 5-6 times. So we can now calculate the concept of real minimum wage, which I've done here. In 1967, the real minimum wage was $5.80, and in 2018 it was $8.65. For this calculation, I'm using $2,002. So we can say it's in real terms because we're using the price. The actual calculation is done this way. I take $1.05 divided by 18.1 and then multiply by 100. Do the same thing for the CPI in 2018. So what we can say now is that the change in the nominal minimum wage went up about 12 times, but the real minimum wage, while it increased much slower. That's step 2 to understand the distinction between nominal and real wage.